Why would one of the most successful and influential writers of the past few decades, Christian writers, spend so much time talking about grace? This is a question I've had for a long time, and our guest today, Philip Yancey, answers this in a recent book he has called Where the Light Fell, which is a memoir of his life. As we're going to get into today, there's a lot of hurt, there's some brokenness, but there's some powerful just glimpses of God's grace that has shaped his life and his ministry and his writing. And I can't wait to get into it. So, Philip, thanks so much for coming on the show.
I've been looking forward to this, Sean.
So, in college, two writers that most influenced me would be Henry Nouwen and
Mm.
you. So, I want you to know that your writings were really just kind of like a lifeboat for me in many ways, going through a period of questioning and doubt to think about things. And I'm hoping people watching this, if they've had hurt or doubt or questions in their life, we can probe into some of your story to help them in a way that it helped to me. But before we get into your story, I'm just curious to start off with what makes writing a memoir different than the other books you've written, such as, say, Disappointment with God or Soul Survivor?
Well, all of my books are what I call personal pilgrimage books. I take
Mm,
any topic, prayer, Jesus, grace, and walk through what I used to think about it, how I got disabused of that, and what I think about it now, what I've
mm,
learned. And I write my books. I'm a journalist. I'm a fellow pilgrim in the pew. I'm not an expert. I'm not a professor. I'm not a pastor ordained. I'm a pilgrim. And because I'm a freelance writer, I don't report to anybody. I don't have a
mm,
board, so I can just tackle a project. And I start with questions usually that I don't know the answers to. And my
mm.
book is the process of trying to figure out some of those things. The memoir is different, however. And I had to learn. It took me 3 times as long as any other book that I've done
Wow.
because I kept wanting to add little comments and little asides. And anytime a memoir sounds like an essay, it's a bad memoir. So I wrote this long book, and then I had some great editorial
Mm,
friends who would go through and say, Philip, this is an essay. You got to
mm,
get that out of there. And uh, in that way, it was a completely different experience because it's
mm,
pure narrative. I'm just telling the
mm,
story. I'm not trying to make a point. I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm just saying this is what happened in my life.
mm. Well, it's clear you're not preaching, but these life principles just come out of your reflection and your experience. And you had me at the first line. You start off with a line talking about your father's death.
Hmm.
Can
Yeah.
you describe what happened to him and also how you accidentally learned of the backstory and then how that shaped your understanding of really yourself?
Sure. Yes, I was just a year old when my father died. Of
Mm,
course, I knew I grew up without a father, so I knew about his death. He was always painted as this kind of giant Christian. He really became a Christian late in life. He was in the Navy. And then he had a short but remarkable tenure where he was going around bringing people to God. Uh,
mm,
Things he had missed out on as a kid, he wanted everybody to experience now. It really was good news to him. It was transforming. And he and my mother met, they married, they agreed to go as missionaries to Africa. They already had a mailing list of about 5,000 people who agreed to
mm,
support them and pray for them. And they were ready to go. They were just raring to go. And then a pandemic hit.
mm,
In those days, 1950, the pandemic was polio. Mostly it affected children, but my father was one of the unlucky adults. He was 23, got sick, got completely paralyzed overnight where he couldn't move
mm,
anything, couldn't move any muscle in his body, could not
mm,
even move his lungs, couldn't breathe on his own. So they put him in an iron lung. And I knew all that. And I knew that, of course, he died. What I didn't know, and I found out 17 years later, I'm a college student. I'm bringing my girlfriend over to meet my grandparents. And she's being very polite, wants to know, tell me about the Yanceys. And we go through this old scrapbook, and a newspaper clipping falls out. It's from the Atlanta Constitution, the large newspaper in Atlanta, and it's about an apparent miracle. Here is it's my father, and there's my mother feeding him in bed. And the story is they removed him from the iron lung against medical advice because they believed he would be healed. And
mm,
they put him in another little clinic that really didn't have equipment to handle a polio patient. And at the time that article was written, he was showing a little bit of progress, thought he could move a toe here or there. And much more comfortable out of the machine. And there was a lot of talk about God told us this and God told us that. And then I looked at the date of the newspaper, and it was 9 days before he died. And I
Wow.
realized this was a secret I had never known. I knew about his death, but this secret, when families keep secrets, they tend to get their own power, and when they come
Mm,
out, they can be explosive.
mm,
And that was true in my life, because I realized these people, they loved him, they were supporting him, but they made a tragic mistake in theology. They believed God spoke to them, and evidently they were wrong, because God did not say remove him from the iron lung and he'll be healed. It didn't work out that way.
mm,
And it worked out in kind of poisonous ways, because my mother, of course, felt guilty, felt betrayed, she felt shattered, all of her dreams. And she decided to solve that problem by placing all of her dreams on two children, me and my
mm,
brother.
mm,
And we were supposed to fulfill my father's role as a missionary in Africa, and anything other than that would be a disaster. And when we became teenagers and started to individuate and didn't quite turn out exactly like she wanted, in a lot of ways, she went off the rails. And my brother went one
mm,
direction, I went another direction, and we both went through some pretty chaotic years just trying to get
mm,
away from that vow she made, which felt like a curse at various times.
mm. Your book is very raw and very real about some of that hurt that you're describing with your brother, with your mom. And I want to come back to that. But you have a
Mm.
line where you say, "My father isn't even a memory, only a scar." What do you mean by that? And what was it like
Yeah.
growing up without a father?
Well, of course, these days it's not unusual. There are a lot of single parent families.
Mm,
Back in my day, there weren't. I
mm,
remember I was probably in the third or fourth grade before I ever heard the word divorce. I didn't know any kids who
huh.
grew up, with one parent and divorced from another parent. But I knew I didn't have anybody to teach me how to throw a baseball, to stick up for me when the bullies attacked,
Mm,
just those basic things that we rely on fathers for. My mother, like a lot of mothers, tended to be a little overprotective, trying to keep us within bounds. And boys don't like boundaries; they like to push the edges of the envelope, and so there were a lot of clashes going on there. And I guess I missed the balance of the father mother. I think God had a good
mm,
plan in mind, where he had two different
mm,
personalities to balance each other off. And nobody could talk my mother out of overreacting to something. She had the burden of
mm,
turning us out the way she wanted to. And
mm,
when that didn't happen, nobody said, "Well, they're just boys; they'll grow out of it eventually." She
mm.
she freaked out.
Talk a little bit about your mom, if you don't mind. She seems to be kind of a golden thread through the story, with both you and your brother just relating to her, understanding her, feeling, sometimes it might not be an overstatement to say, kind of feeling oppressed by her, but also hoping there would be a kind of reconciliation, yet also living in the tension of the public reputation she had versus your experience kind of behind closed doors. What was she like, and how
Mm.
did that shape you?
Yes, the public reputation. She was a Bible teacher. She taught Bible clubs in people's homes, and I learned the Bible pretty young, because I would go to every one. We couldn't afford babysitters, so every
Hmm.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I would hear the same Bible
Wow.
stories, and I got them down after a while. And she would always teach Sunday school in church. She ran summer camps, the educational program, and she worked hard. My goodness, she was not prepared for life.
Hmm.
She had never driven a car, didn't have a
Huh.
driver's license. She had never written a check. And suddenly, boom, she's thrust into this role of being a mother without any safe income whatsoever, in a different part of the country. She was raised in Philadelphia, and now she's in Atlanta, Georgia, the South, during the civil rights movement.
Wow.
So it was a difficult time. And that was a public persona. She was viewed as this very hardworking, righteous woman. She was also a wounded person. Her
Hmm.
own background was more harsh than mine, I must say. I
Hmm.
know her parents, and I know the environment in which she was raised, and it was tough. And then this tragedy occurred that really defined her life, and she felt, I'm sure, the guilt and anger, and she didn't know where to do that. In her theology, you couldn't really be disappointed with God. You couldn't be angry at God.
Hmm.
I see that differently because I've read the Bible, and there's a lot of anger against God in Psalms,
Yeah.
Job, Lamentations, book like that.
Yeah.
So I wish she could have expressed that, but she didn't believe she could. And she also had this theology that she believed she could reach a state of sinlessness.
Hmm.
And I remember when we were teenagers, she told us one time that she hadn't sinned in 12 years. Well, it's hard enough to win an argument with your parent as a teenager. It's really hard when they haven't ever sinned. And, and
Wow.
so that became kind of a box. And when we
Hmm.
strayed from her ideals for us, she really became almost out of control. So we were stuck with
Hmm.
the outer person, this
Hmm.
wonderful, hardworking, righteous person, and the inside our house, there was a lot of conflict and maybe some abuse going on. We
Hmm.
were we were poor. I know the pressures now she must have been under financially. She never knew whether
Hmm.
she'd have enough money to put food on the table. And we lived in a trailer, not a very big one, about 8 feet wide,
Hmm.
48 feet long, on church property. So I could never get away from this religious environment. I've been
Hmm.
raised with these Bible clubs, and now I'm actually living on church property. So I've got to be there every time the door is open. The revival tent is put up in my backyard every summer.
Hmm.
And I got a solid dose of Southern fundamentalism, believe me.
Hmm. I'd always wondered about that from a lot of your writings. There must be some experience that you reflect upon a lot and challenge growing up. So take a minute and unpack that a little bit more if you can. Just how it sounds like you went to church almost every day. The church was next door. How much of your life is defined by this fundamentalist upbringing?
It was completely immersed in it. And as
Hmm.
a kid, I believed everything that the adults told me. And when we create our little subcultures like that, it's easy just to be around people who think like you.
Hmm.
And I just swallowed whatever they told me. And there was a crack that came, especially in high school days. Of course, my mind was being broadened in literature classes. I'm reading books that showed me a different way of living. It showed me different slices of the world. And the race issue was very hot in
Hmm.
Atlanta in those days. Martin Luther King was our most famous citizen. He's in the news every day, and there are demonstrations going on. There are lawsuits. There are governors opposing any attempt to integrate. And that was the first thing that cracked for me because I was
Hmm.
taught directly from church that people of color were inferior races that were cursed by God and made to serve the white race. I mean, it's still going on
Hmm.
now, amazingly, 60 years
Hmm.
later, but everybody I knew in church kind of viewed it that way. And I had an experience I describe in the book about a, a fellowship I got for a summer job. And I went to it was then called the Communicable Disease Center. It's now called the Center for Disease Control. And Anthony Fauci, people like that, they come out of CDC. This huge complex, very sophisticated in the suburbs of Atlanta. And I knew that my supervisor for the summer was a PhD from an Ivy League school, renowned, had quite a reputation as a biochemist in staining bacteria, particularly. So I studied up to try to impress him. I'm a high school student, and I go to this PhD professor and open the door to meet him for the first time. And he's African American. He's a black man,
Hmm.
and little alarm bells went out. Wait a minute. If if the church is right about people being cursed by God
Hmm.
and never being able to rise above a certain level, this doesn't compute. This man, and he became a friend. He's a gentle, wise, brilliant man. And I realized the church had misrepresented reality. The
Hmm.
church had lied to me in a way. They said that black people could never achieve like that.
Hmm.
And if they lied to me about race, maybe they lied to me about Jesus, maybe they lied to me
Wow.
about the Bible. And it became a crisis of faith. It went on for several years, just trying to figure out, wait a minute, I can't trust the church anymore because I've been
Hmm.
betrayed. And I think
Mm,
it's so important. I know there are a lot of people who have walked away from the church over one issue, and some of
mm,
these issues are really important. Some churches are anti-science. Some
mm,
churches are really tough on gender issues. Some people talk about being wounded by the church because of a divorce or something like that, where they're treated like second-class citizens.
mm,
And they say, okay, I'll just walk away from the church. And I was sure tempted. I understand that. But later, I came to know a different God, a different version of God than I was brought
mm.
up with. Because the worst thing the church did for me was misrepresent God Himself
Whew.
as kind of this cosmic bully up in the sky who's just waiting to squash people who might be enjoying themselves or might be straying from this narrow little path. And I heard about that God of judgment and punishment every Sunday. And I didn't hear about a God of grace and a God of mercy and a God of love
Mm,
and forgiveness. I didn't hear about the prodigal son kind of God,
mm,
the father wanting his family back. And and when I did, I realized that would be a terrible trade to give away the possibility to connect to the creator of the universe just because of the way I was treated or the way my church misinterpreted some things. That's a bad trade. I need to
mm.
somehow find my way back into a relationship with that God.
There's a line in your book where you said, when you were kind of growing up in the fundamentalist church, maybe God is like my mother, a super person who both loves me and schemes to break me.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem to capture the view of God you were taught? And how did that start to change?
Yes, it does capture. Although I didn't understand much love coming from that God. It was mostly
Mm,
this fearsome character who wanted to break me. I want to
mm,
create these little puppets who look alike and behave alike and make sure they don't do the same
mm,
things, And I didn't really understand God as a loving person. And I go back now and read the Bible, read the Gospels, and I think, how did I miss it? John in First John says God is love. It doesn't say God
mm,
loves. It said God is love.
mm,
It's a noun, not a verb. It's God's essence. God cannot help loving. That's his. That's who he is. It's like the sun radiates light.
mm,
God radiates love, and and the reason the world exists, the reason the universe exists, is because God is seeking objects for his love.
mm,
The love is out there. It's just flowing all the time, and we can put ourselves in the middle of it, or we can turn our backs and try to run away from it.
mm,
And I have the example of my brother who actually to this
mm.
day is still doing that. And um, a lot of it has to do with being unable to overcome that image of God that he took away from that church.
Hmm. Well, I want to talk about your conversion story. I think it's powerful. But before we get there, I think for people to really appreciate and understand what it was like, we've got to talk a little bit more about your relationship with your brother, which you go into some depth in the
Mm.
book, and what it was like at kind of this fundamentalist Bible college. So let's start a little bit with your brother. He's your older brother. I mean, I couldn't believe some of the journey you're describing him going on. I'm thinking, my word, this guy's experienced so much and where
Yeah.
he's at now. So, just as much as you're comfortable, give us a sense of who he is, your dynamic with him, and how he responded very differently to growing up in this kind of fundamentalist background than you did.
Right. Yes, his name is Marshall. He's 2 years older than I am,
Mm,
and he was my protector growing up. I skipped a grade in school because so I was always the youngest and usually the smallest kid in class, and
mm,
it's like I had a target on my back for bullies.
mm.
But my brother was around, and he was 2 years older, and when I was in trouble, I'd say, Marshall, I'm having problems, and he'd walk me home, and
That's cool.
and he also fought my battles for me. Being older, he would tend to be the one to engage our mother in fights, and I would see the two of them just screaming at each other,
Mm,
and decide I don't want to go there. I want to find a different way. So I became kind of sneaky. I just was quiet and I didn't engage in the fights. I just did what I wanted and tried not to let anybody know it.
mm,
And at the same time, he was very sincere about his faith for a time. He was amazingly gifted musically. He
Hmm.
had absolute pitch. 1 in 10,000 people have that. He had it. So you could put your 10 fingers down anywhere on the piano. He could tell you what notes they are. And he had an
Wow.
almost perfect musical memory. So he could hear something on the radio while he's sitting in a restaurant and a week later sit down and play it. Just amazing stuff.
Hmm.
And in fact, he went to a conservatory of music, went to a Bible college first, then a conservatory. And this was the 60s when people are taking over buildings and taking the dean of students hostage, things like that. Crazy things were happening. And he went to Wheaton College, the conservatory, and he thought, they can't make me graduate from this school. So he dropped out his last semester,
Hmm.
just one more semester. And he came back to Atlanta, became one of our original hippies in Atlanta, and hung out in Piedmont Park taking LSD and watching the clouds and watching the trees, what hippies did in those days. And from there, he moved to California, where there were whole colonies of hippies,
Hmm.
and he experimented with almost everything, every kind of sexual experience and alcohol and drugs. And I watched my brother, and I
Hmm.
watched him make these choices, and he was trying to get as far away from that narrow legalistic church as he could,
Hmm.
and he succeeded in doing that. But it wasn't an attractive path to me. I could see how, instead of being a concert pianist, which he had the ability to do, he ended up tuning pianos, playing the same note over and over,
Hmm.
and I saw how he thought he was free. He was going to get away from these strictures, but actually he ended up being kind of enslaved. That's what
Hmm.
addictions are. They're a form of slavery, and they make you think you're just expanding your mind. Actually, it gradually destroyed his mind, and ultimately he had a stroke. This is about
Hmm.
11 years ago, so he's in his early 60s at the time, and he's disabled. He's coping
Hmm.
pretty well, and I have a lot of hope for him. We're kind of his
Hmm.
guardians. I
Hmm.
spent a good portion of this week trying to help him out when he lost his iPhone, and
Hmm.
things like that are major problems for him. But he lives on his own. He's learned to drive a car with the pedals reversed and an
Okay.
adapted vehicle. So he's doing all right. And my prayer for him is just that God would surround him by Christian friends who live out love and
Hmm.
grace. And that
Hmm.
prayer has been answered. Virtually everybody who helps him out on when he's in a need, they're Christians that I've
Hmm.
introduced him to and that care for him,
Hmm.
and they just demonstrate the love of Christ. Um,
Hmm.
he's heard the other side. He needs to see God's love lived out in
Hmm.
flesh.
You describe a curse that your mother had said to him that just seemingly kind of haunted
Mm,
him throughout his life. And I know
yeah,
it's raw to talk about it, but you discuss in the book, and it just seems so formative to his experience. What was that?
right. Well, it's when he decided to go to Wheaton, actually.
Hmm.
Most parents I know would be thrilled if their children went to Wheaton. Wheaton is a Christian college. Sometimes it's called the
Yeah.
Harvard of the Christian world. And but my mother has a much more extreme form of faith. She doesn't like Wheaton. She thinks they're liberal. I
Hmm.
remember saying, "Well, Billy Graham went there." Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. They're liberal. He's got these liberals on the platform. He
Wow.
consorts with Catholics. He went to Russia, and so that I lost that argument. And when my brother decided to go there, she was just searching for ways to stop him. First, she threatened to get a
Hmm.
warrant for federal kidnapping for the guy
Wow.
that was going to drive him to Wheaton. And she was serious. She would have done it. And he changed plans and flew on Delta Airlines instead of being driven there. And then she said, I'd rather you go to a school like Harvard, frankly, because they don't even believe in God. Wheaton, they pretend to believe in God, but it's not the right God. It's not our God, our version of God. And she said, I tell you what, if you do this rebellious act, like going to Wheaton College, I will pray every day for the rest of my life that God will break you,
Ooh,
either have you in a terrible accident so that you're
man.
paralyzed and lie there and look at the ceiling and realize what a terrible thing you've done. And when she said that, I thought of my father, that lying there in an
Mm,
iron lung looking at the ceiling. How can you pray a curse like that? My brother has a different memory. We were both
mm.
there, and I'm sure I'm right, and he's sure he's right.
Of
And
course.
his memory is not that he would be paralyzed, but that he would lose his mind. And that's what
Mm,
happened when he dropped out.
mm,
He went to a psychiatrist, and they had diagnosed him as a chronic paranoid schizophrenic. And I
mm,
don't know. In those days, they were giving young men. Sometimes they would give them a diagnosis to keep them out of the army, to keep them out of the draft,
mm,
and that might have been somebody cutting him some slack. I don't know. Is my brother crazy? I don't know.
mm.
It's kind of a moot point after his stroke, but
Sure.
that was a curse that haunted him. And years later, my goodness, 30 years later, he's still inside him, just as he was living, and to this day lives inside his mother. That's that unforgiveness thing, where if somebody doesn't make the move, they're
Mm,
both chained, and the wronged party and the right party, they're both chained. And unless somebody breaks that chain, and the only
mm,
way is to say, I'm sorry, or I forgive
mm.
you. And it's a hard thing to do. So they've not seen each other in 51 years.
Oh
There's
my
just three of us in
goodness.
our family, a
Wow.
mother and two sons, and one she's not seen in 51 years.
Gosh, that's devastating. I
Mm.
can't thank you enough for the honesty of you writing these things. I can't imagine what it was like to revisit a lot of this and the pain that is still there. If we jump back to your story, you talk about
Mm.
going to a fundamentalist Bible college. And it seems like your faith is unraveling, maybe junior high, high school years, but college, you really start
Right.
to carve out kind of your own niche and rebellion against this fundamentalism. What was that experience like in college?
Hmm. When I had lived in that subculture enough, I knew how to fake it.
Hmm.
I knew how to pray prayers that would get people saying amen. I knew how to give testimonies that would bring tears to their eyes. I knew how to go forward and accept Jesus. I did it many, many times. And after a while, you can't tell the fake from the real. And
Hmm.
that's how I felt. So I went to this Bible college, and when I went there, I thought, well, maybe they've got reality, and I'll find it. And then I quickly
Hmm.
concluded, no, it's just a form of behavior modification. If you can rate here if you just follow the script and do what good little Christians are supposed to do. And suddenly I had no more energy to follow the script, and I became
Hmm.
kind of the campus cynic, and people would pray about me in faculty prayer meetings, and I enjoyed that. I would sit out in the patio and read books like Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell, and things like that. Just looking back now, kind of
Hmm.
adolescent arrogance, if anything.
Hmm.
And I was pretty resistant, very resistant. You have to be in a place like that because some of them
Hmm.
were praying for demons in me, and I just would have nothing to do with it. I was very cynical. I
Hmm.
would ask questions in class deliberately to expose the ignorance of professors in
Hmm.
certain areas, and it's just kind of a jerk, really.
Hmm.
And uh, then some things happened that softened that arrogance, that softened that bitter cynicism. The name of this book that we've been talking about, my memoir, is called Where the Light Fell. And it comes from a quote by St. Augustine, who said, I couldn't look at the sun directly, but I could look on where the light fell,
Hmm.
where the rays of the sun lit. And that's how I felt. I couldn't look at the sun directly. I had been scorched by the sun. And
Hmm.
and I thought God, being the sun, God was just this bully, just a bully trying to
Hmm.
break people, trying to ruin our lives.
Hmm.
And three things gradually softened me. The beauties of nature. When I grew up in that dysfunctional family, my solace was to go and walk in the woods and listen to the birds and
Hmm.
look at the ponds and the animals and dig for insects and old rotten logs, things like that. That was where I found peace. So the beauties of nature, classical music, which I knew from my brother, and then I played the piano a little bit myself, and then romantic love. And
Hmm.
I did experience that. I experienced that, all three of those things. They weren't spiritual things in the eyes of this campus, but they were things that were happening to me to soften me. And there's a quote you probably know, from G.K. Chesterton, and I think he borrowed it from somebody else, but he said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he
Hmm.
feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank.
Hmm.
And that's how I felt. I was feeling alive for the first time. I was experiencing beauty, and and I had no one to thank because I had this image of
Hmm.
God as anti-human. And then
Hmm.
I realized, no, God, this world was created by God. God made these things. God invented love. God invented beauty. These are all signs of what God is like. And I couldn't have been reached by a gospel tract, for example. I
Hmm.
knew those backwards and forwards, and I was steeled against them, almost immunized against them. But God graciously kind of snuck around in an end run
Hmm.
and touched me, by common grace. I guess the
Hmm.
theologians would say, by common grace first. But I never could make that jump and connect. That old question, what's the fake and what's the real? I would go back and pray every once in a while, but, well, is that a real prayer or is that a fake prayer? Did I mean that or did I not mean it? I couldn't tell the difference.
Hmm.
And then I did have this dramatic conversion experience that I wasn't really looking for and wasn't really desiring, but it happened to me, and it changed my life completely from that moment on.
Recently interviewed Hal Poe, who has an excellent book on the conversion of C.S. Lewis, that period in his life. He goes from
Mm,
atheist to Christian, and these moments of joy and beauty are really what drew him in. You talk about starting to
mm.
read C.S. Lewis at this season and how that shaped you. What were some of the things he said or the way he approached just theology and life and philosophy that started to connect some dots in your mind towards a genuine relationship with God?
Yeah, the reason I started reading C.S. Lewis is because he was a persona non grata on our campus. so, so we were told, uh, well, he says some good things. You got to be really careful because he smoked a pipe and he drank beer. And I thought, oh, that's my kind of guy. I think I'll start reading him.
That's awesome.
And this was in the 1960s. He'd only been dead for a few years, so some of these
Yeah.
books were just now making their way
Hmm.
across the Atlantic. I remember one of the books that just jumped out at me was A Grief Observed. I read that, and he wrote it as his wife was dying of cancer, and I had never seen
Hmm.
anybody that honest, just taking God to task. Where were you
Hmm.
just when I need you most? It's like you slammed the door shut and bolted it with double locks.
Hmm.
Wow, he's talking about prayer. and in the church I grew up with, you said something like that, and God would hit you with a lightning bolt. But actually, he's being very biblical. If you look at Job, if you look at
Yeah.
a lot of the Psalms, you see that same outrage. God, and I came to respect a God who not only lets you doubt, gives us the freedom to doubt, but gives the words you can use. I mean, they're in the Bible. And I found, even in the classes I was taking, God is not an arm twister. Was not an arm twister. He never said, okay, rich man, give away all. Oh, that's too much. Okay, how about starting with 10%? We can work you in a little bit. He wouldn't do that. He would just say, it's my path is not easy, and it's up to you whether you want to follow me or not. And it may involve taking up a cross, but
Hmm.
it's worthwhile. You got to trust me on that. And if you don't, well, I'm sorry. I think you're making a wrong choice, but I'm
Hmm.
not going to force you. I'm not going
Hmm.
to force a decision. So different from these revival speakers that'll play just one more verse of "Just as I Am,"
Yeah. Yeah.
and uh, and I came to like Jesus. And uh, back to C.S. Lewis, I also I remember reading his Space trilogy. I don't think they're necessarily the best books that he wrote, but they got to me because they made me think, what if it's real? What if there really are evil forces and good
Hmm.
forces? invisible to us? What if there really is a heaven and a hell? And what if there are other planets? And it just got my mind going in a different direction. And it was later, frankly, that I came to the more apologetics type books,
Hmm.
Mere Christianity and some of those books. They were so helpful in bolstering my faith, but they weren't what drew me to it. What drew me
Hmm.
to it were the more emotional ones, like
Hmm.
A Grief Observed, frankly.
So you describe a class assignment where you were assigned to write on a time where you've heard God speak to you, and this sent you into kind of a mild crisis. You're like, I don't know that God has spoken to me, but then an experience that you now attribute actually to your conversion itself. I'd love to have you share that.
Right. Yeah, I've never really shared it in detail as long as I've been writing,
Hmm.
um, because when you say this is how I got converted, it's easy for other people to say, "Well, I never had that experience,"
Hmm.
and I'm not trying to hold this up as a model. On the other hand, it happened,
Hmm.
and it was the most important moment of my life.
Hmm.
It started out. I had this assignment. We had a Christian service assignment. And my assignment was to go to this local university and witness. And I tried that a couple times, and it was pretty embarrassing. So I just gave up, and I would sit in the student lounge and watch basketball games on television, and then I'd come back and write up some story about who I talked to,
Oh, wow.
And I mean, that was just my cynical self. There were a team of about three people plus me were on that university team, and then we would come back once a week and have a prayer meeting. And the prayer meeting always went the same way. Joe would pray, Chris would pray, Craig would pray. They'd wait about 10 seconds. Of course, I never prayed. And then we'd say, okay, see you next week, guys. And these were good guys. They knew where I was, and they didn't try to force me,
Hmm.
and neither did they report me to the dean for making up some of these stories. So these are good guys. And one day, without any planning, without any prompting, now I'd been given this assignment about write a paper on when God spoke to you, and I had no idea what I was going to say because again, I can't tell the real from the fake. So I didn't know what to write. Maybe that was in the back of the mind. I don't know. But Joe, Chris, Craig prayed, and it was 10 seconds, and before that ended, I said God, and everybody kind of stopped and sat up, and it was pretty tense. And I said, I don't care about those people at the university. I don't care if they all go to hell.
Hmm.
And it was very tense in the room. And I don't even care if I go to hell. You'd have to be on a Bible college to realize what that must have sounded like.
Sure.
But they were cool guys. They just sat there. And I started praying along that vein, just that cynical, arrogant self. And then I don't know what to call it. It was a revelation. It was visual to me. Maybe you could call it a vision. I didn't believe in visions at the time, but it was a revelation. I started talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is not what Jesus had in mind when he told this parable at all, but I said, we're supposed to be like this Good Samaritan, reaching down to these poor, bloodied university students who don't have the light yet, and we're bringing healing to them. But while I was talking, the the pictures, the characters changed. I saw the Good Samaritan as Jesus himself, the images we have of Jesus reaching down, and the person in the ditch, the bloodied figure in the ditch, I saw as myself. And I realized just in a flash that I, who thought I was so superior to these other people around me in the Bible college, I
Wow.
was probably the neediest one of all. And
Hmm.
my problem was that I didn't know how to admit that need. And and as every time Jesus would lean down to help me, I would spit in his face. I remember that very clearly, just the spittle
Hmm.
dripping down his cheek. And it was very upsetting to me. I didn't know what to do with it. So I just stopped praying and got up and walked out.
Hmm.
And I remember I wrote my girlfriend a note that night saying, I may have had the first truly religious experience of my life tonight.
Wow.
We'll see if it pans out.
Hmm.
And the next day, it was still haunting me. And
Hmm.
the next day. So finally I said, well, if this really happened, I need to own it. So
Hmm.
I wrote about the experience and ended up reading it in the class. This is when God spoke to me. And again, you could come up with psychological explanations, but it felt to me as if I was touched by God. It
Hmm.
truly did. It's not something that
Hmm.
I was seeking. It was one of those God's sense of humor acts of grace.
Hmm.
Here's this
Hmm.
wounded kid who thinks he's something special. I'll show him a different side.
Hmm.
And and it that's why I keep talking about grace, because I
Hmm.
was truly graced by God. It's not something I manufactured. It's not something I was trying to impress people with. I was going the other direction fast, and God reached down and stopped. When I think back on the people in the Bible, so many of them are like that. Jacob, uh, cheating all the way, and Jonah trying to get out of there, and the Apostle Paul making a living as an abuser, human rights abuser of Christians. And it's as if God says, I'll show them.
Hmm.
There are other ways. And again, I'm not saying this is what should happen to anybody else in the world, but I just have to say this is what happened to me. And
Hmm.
I certainly wouldn't be a Christian writer if that night had not taken place. It just changed everything for me.
I have a number of people who will watch this show and good chance this interview who are either atheists or people within the church just going through periods of doubt, skepticism, hurt. And I get emails all the time from people saying, my faith is just hanging on by a thread. What do I
Mm.
do? And so much of it is similar to your experience. Not all of it, but a lot of it is just hurt and pain and hypocrisy and disillusionment at the church. I can imagine some people saying, hey, that's great for you, Philip. If God did that for
Mm.
me, I would believe. What would you say to somebody who's going through that hurt right now and maybe hasn't had that dramatic experience that you had?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say, well, you got to pray for one like mine. God doesn't work
Hmm.
that way. But I would also say, well, I'll tell you this. A nephew of mine sent me a saying one time. There's a juice factory, and it puts little sayings in the bottle caps, kind of like a Chinese fortune cookie. And you peel off the bottle cap and you look at your fortune for the day. And this saying went like this: an idea cannot be held responsible for the people who believe it. An idea cannot be held responsible for
Hmm.
the people who believe it. And when I think about that, I think of the church. For me, the church is God's greatest gamble. In fact, if I was God, I don't think I would trust human beings to carry the message of the good news. Look at the mess we've made of it.
Hmm.
So many people are turned away from the church, hurt by the church, wounded by the church. And when they tell me their stories, often I'll just sit back and say, "Oh man, it's worse than that. Let me tell you about my church." And then they look at me, "Wait a minute, I thought you were a Christian writer." And I say, "Well, I am. I am." And I think it'd be a pretty bad trade to sacrifice a chance to connect to the creator of everything that's good in the world because of the way some ordinary people treated you in church. I
Hmm.
understand that. I lived through it. I get it. And I've come to learn that God respects rebels. You look at the book of Job.
Hmm.
There were three theologians, his friends, and then a fourth one came along pretty late, and they all had the right doctrine. They had it all lined up. Job, obviously, you've done something wrong because of what you're going through now, so God is punishing you. And at the end, God appears, silences all of Job's doubts, and says, Job, at least you were honest. At least you told it like it is.
Hmm.
And your friends here, I won't even listen to their prayers unless you pray for them. I love that twist. It's like God takes the one kind of most cynical person who's been raving against him and says he's my hero.
Hmm.
And I'm an advocate of doubt, because doubting some of the crazy things my church taught me actually brought me into a whole different experience of what God is like. I
Hmm.
doubted that narrow-minded, legalistic, shrunken, angry view of God. I learned God is large
Hmm.
and has big shoulders and can take it, and mainly wants his family back. That's what God
Hmm.
wants. So I would just say, be careful not to trade away a chance to have a living, ongoing connection with the creator of the universe because of church wounds. I know a lot of, I
Hmm.
understand, I know where they came from. I was so tempted. I went through that myself. But I got to tell you, especially watching my brother trying to get away from the church as far as possible, just make your choices really carefully. God gives
Hmm.
you that freedom to make those choices.
Hmm.
Look at the people you most want to be like, you most want to learn from. And very often at the core, you're going to find the very things that Jesus talked about.
Hmm. In light of your memoir, your story, again, we're here with Philip Yancey talking about his book "Where the Light Fell," just a story of redemption, discovering God, reconciliation. I have a question about what
Mm.
advice you would give to apologists. And one of the
To
opening
apologize.
chapters in your book, Vanishing Grace, I think is just fantastic. That book,
Mm.
Vanishing Grace, and The Lure of Gentleness by Dallas Willard are two of the books that
Mm.
I highly recommend to apologists. And you talk a lot about how, I think there's a line in there where you say, God is not interested in the number of arguments that we win, but the love that we show to people with
Mm.
whom we disagree.
Yeah.
Talk about that, or just maybe one or two pieces of advice for how apologists could do their task well.
Right. Well, I'm all in favor of apologetics. And I have spent 40 years writing kind of rational, idea driven books.
Yeah.
Here's what I believe about Jesus. Here's what I believe about grace. Here's what I think about the Old Testament. And, I've made my living. This one is a very different book because I call it a prequel.
Hmm.
The other one showed what I believe, spelled out what I believe. This one shows why I believe it, or how I came to believe it. And I mentioned in the book that uh, an apologist, a rational philosopher from Canada, wrote me one time and said, why did you become a Christian? And I wrote a little version of what I've been talking about. And he wrote back and said, oh, I didn't know this. You must be a fideist. Fideist. I don't even know how to say it. And I didn't know what it meant. So I looked it up, and it said one who believes out of faith rather than rational argument or something. And I said, well, I don't know, but I got to tell you, if that night had not happened, I wouldn't be writing Christian books. I know
Hmm.
that, and I did explore later and explore in my writing what I believe in, trying to dust off the stuff. We all do that. Richard Rohr talks about we go through processes of order, disorder, and then reorder. And order for me was growing up
Hmm.
this tight little narrow fundamentalist church, and I believed it all. I drank the Kool-Aid. And then it started to crack apart, and that introduced a period of disorder, and I threw it all away. And I would say to parents, when your kids do that, don't freak out.
Hmm.
That's just part of growing up. It's part of maturing, and they may well come back. You can pray for them. You can pray to surround them with Christian peers. Parents have limited control during that period. So there's order, and then disorder, and then reorder.
Hmm.
And my whole life as a writer has been trying to construct that reorder. Okay, I do believe in Jesus, but not the Jesus that I was taught in Sunday school, not a Mr. Rogers kind of Jesus, a different kind of
Hmm.
Jesus. So I'd write a book, The Jesus That I Never Knew.
Hmm.
And yeah, your question, the best apologetic we have is the visible apologetic of changed lives.
Hmm.
Uh, that's always been true. You go back to the astounding growth of the church in the Roman Empire, this tiny little group considered a sect of Judaism, just like a cult. The Romans were very skeptical of these Christians and would torture them and would, put them in the Colosseum with lions and gladiators and things. And yet, within 3 centuries, more than half of all the people in the Roman Empire were Christians, and even the government became officially Christian. What happened? Well, what happened was they started living in a way where the Romans would look at them and say, I like the way they live better than the way I live.
Mm.
I want what they're drinking, I want
Mm.
that living water. And just things like they didn't abandon their babies that they didn't want like the Romans did. In fact, they took those babies and adopted them and raised them. And when a pandemic would hit in those days, all the Romans would flee into the hills so they wouldn't get sick. The Christians would stay behind and nurse not only their relatives, but their pagan neighbors' relatives. And you just can't argue with that. If we lived out, go back to Jesus last night with his disciples, John 13-17, those beautiful passages. He talks about love and being the mark of the Christian, and service and unity. And if we really lived those things out, then people would come to us and say, I want what you've got. And I think of Stanley Hauerwas, who would keep saying, the church should be the church. That's our job. The church should be like Jesus. It's the body of Christ. What it means is the visible presence of God in the world. When Jesus was here, if you wanted to know what God was like, you would look at Jesus. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Whoa, what a statement. This is the way God is like. And these stories I've been telling you, like the prodigal son, that's what God is like. This is who God is. And then Jesus said, but I've done my part. It's up to you now. I'm leaving. Bye. And it's up to us, the body of Christ. Think about that phrase, the visible presence of God in the world. And the way that people are really going to be convinced that the whole thing is true is if we Christians act like it's true.
Amen to that. You and I were chatting before about cancel culture, and the very thing cancel culture lacks is grace and forgiveness. And yet, not only do you think Christianity is true, but it's unique to Christianity that God's grace is a free gift if we're willing to accept it. And yet, you also write in your book that if we're not, there's a point where you discuss how you were kind of at this fundamentalist Bible college. You go visit the college and you're like, there's nothing about our lives that felt attractive to secular, college, for lack of a better term. Why would they be receptive to our message? Right. And what you're saying in so much of your writings is there's something beautiful about grace. There's something beautiful about the sacrificial love of Christ, and it's deeply countercultural. So you wrote at the end that you've been writing, I think, 5 decades. Here's to 5 decades more plus. Talking about grace. I got to pause again and just say your writings, especially stuff on doubt and disappointment with God, was just huge for me, making sense of my own faith with an apologist father, questioning things and realizing, hey, it's okay to question God. It's okay not to have all the answers. Just your writings, again, were just a lifeline to me. So I hope the apologists will pick up Vanishing Grace is one I'd suggest for my audience. But in particular, this is just a wonderful book, Where the Light Fell, your memoir that came out, really well written. And you're not preaching at the audience, but these lessons come through that are just such life lessons. So can't thank you enough for coming on. And hang on 1 minute afterwards so I can say goodbye. But anything else you want the audience to know about following you? Do you blog, your website, or is just picking up the book the best way we can kind of support and engage what you're doing?
Well, I'm one of the people left who still uses Facebook. I don't use Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, but old guys like me, we still use Facebook. And and also my website, and both of them are just philipyancey.com or Philip Yancey, my name, in Facebook.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, brother.
And thank you for what you do and for carrying on the torch that your father handed you. You made a lot of difference in people's lives.
Thank you.